The Tuesday I checked my account, I was still in my dressing gown. It was 7 in the morning. The kettle was on. The radio was doing the thing it does at 7, that particular morning cheerfulness that feels slightly at odds with how most people actually feel at 7 in the morning. I had my phone in my hand the way I always did, scrolling through nothing in particular while the kettle boiled. I opened my banking app out of habit. I looked at the balance. I looked at it again. I put the phone face down on the counter. I turned off the kettle. I sat down at the kitchen table and I sat there for a very long time. The account I had been looking at was not my current account. It was not the account I used for the weekly shop or the direct debits or the small, ordinary transactions of daily life. It was the other one. The one I had opened in 1987, the year my son Daniel was born, with the specific intention of building something over time that would outlast the years of working and paying and managing. 38 years of something. Gone. Every direct debit I had set up. Every transfer I had made on the first of every month without fail. The inheritance from my mother, which I had put straight in and never touched. The redundancy payment from 2019 that I had invested rather than spent because I had told myself I was fine, I would manage, I was always fine. All of it. The balance was £47. My name is Margaret. I am 63 years old. And the person who had access to that account, the person I had added to it 12 years ago because he was my son and I trusted him, and it seemed like a sensible precaution in case something happened to me, was at that moment, I would later calculate, asleep in the house I had helped him buy. This is the story of the 40 years before that Tuesday, and the 6 months after it. Before I go back to the beginning, welcome if you're new here. This is her Breaking Point Stories. New stories every single day about the moment a woman stopped being silent and chose herself. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let me show you 40 years. Daniel was born in the spring of 1987. He was my first and only child. His father, my husband Colin, was there for the first 4 years and then wasn't, in the particular way of men who decide, around the age of 35, that the life they have built is not the life they imagined and that the solution is to dismantle it and begin again elsewhere. Colin left when Daniel was 4. He moved to Bristol. He remarried. He sent birthday cards that arrived a week late for most of Daniel's childhood, and then stopped arriving at all somewhere around Daniel's 14th birthday. I raised Daniel alone. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters to understand what the savings account meant. When you raise a child alone on one salary, when you are the only person standing between your child and the gaps in things, you learn a particular relationship with money. You learn that it is not abstract. It is the difference between the school trip happening and not happening. It is the winter coat in October. It is the driving lessons at 17. I was careful. I had always been careful. Not mean, not the kind of careful that calculates and withholds, but the kind that is simply aware. That knows what things cost and plans accordingly and never, if it can be avoided, is caught without a buffer. The savings account was my buffer. I added to it every month. Not dramatically, £30 when I was young and £30 was an effort, then 50, then 100 as the salary grew, then more when I was promoted and the mortgage was paid off and the ordinary expenses of life became, for the first time, genuinely manageable. Daniel knew about the account. I had told him about it when he was a teenager, not to burden him with it, but because I believed in being honest about money with children and not pretending it was something other than what it was. I told him, this is what I am building. This is for later. This means that if something happens to me or when I stop working there is something there. He had nodded. He had said, "You're so sensible, Mum." I had thought, yes, I am sensible. This is what sensible looks like. I was 63 years old before I understood that sensible had made me legible. That telling him about the account had not been a gift of transparency. It had been a map. Daniel was, by any reasonable measure, a good son for most of his adult life. He called regularly. He visited at Christmas and Easter without being asked. He helped when I needed help, the time the boiler broke and I didn't know what to do, the time my car needed work and I was overwhelmed by the garage's explanation of what was wrong. He was present in the practical sense. What changed was Natalie. Natalie came into Daniel's life when he was 34. She was 31. She was attractive in the specific way that photographs well, fine-featured, carefully put together, the kind of woman who always looks slightly dressed up even in casual clothes. She worked in a state agency, which meant she had a professional relationship with aspiration, with the difference between what things are worth and what people can be persuaded to pay. I should have thought about that more carefully. She was pleasant to me from the start. Consistently, reliably pleasant. The kind of pleasant that does not vary, that is the same on a Tuesday afternoon as it is at Christmas dinner, that never drops into genuine warmth but never drops into anything worse either. I told myself she was simply reserved. Some people are reserved. They married 2 years after meeting. I helped with the wedding, not the planning. Natalie handled the planning with the brisk efficiency of someone who has strong opinions about venues and flowers and does not particularly require input. But financially, I gave them a substantial gift. I did not consider this a loan. It was a gift, given freely because they were starting a life and I could help, and helping was what I did. The house came next. Daniel had found a property he wanted, just beyond what they could manage on their combined salaries at the time, in the particular way that the houses people want are always slightly beyond what they can manage. He asked me if I would help with the deposit. I gave them £40,000. I want you to hold that number. Not because I need your sympathy for it, I gave it willingly, and I do not regret the giving. But I want you to hold it because it is relevant to what came later. £40,000. The wedding gift on top of that. 2 years of occasional transfers when things were tight, and Daniel mentioned it with the careful casualness of someone who has learned that mentioning is often enough. Natalie, through all of this, remained pleasant. I want to tell you about the evening I was added to their account as an emergency contact. Because that was the evening I made the mistake I would spend 3 years regretting. The evening I said yes to something I should have thought about longer. And the evening Natalie said something to me that I heard and dismissed and have replayed in my mind every day since. The evening I was added to their account was an ordinary Sunday in March. Daniel had brought it up at dinner. They were going on holiday, a 2-week trip to Thailand, and he wanted to make sure that if anything happened while they were away, there was someone who could access their finances. Would I be prepared to be added as an authorized person on their account? I said, of course. What I had not been told, what I did not discover until much later, was that the arrangement was also being made in reverse. That Daniel had been added to my savings account 12 years ago when I had first told him about it, and had, at some point in the intervening time, been given the information he would need to act on that access. I do not know when he gave Natalie the account details. I do not know whether she asked for them or he offered them. What I know is that sometime in the 18 months before the Tuesday morning, a series of transfers had begun. Small at first, 300 here, 500 there. The kind of amounts that would not trigger immediate alarm if you were not checking carefully. Then larger, then regular. Then in the final 3 months, very large indeed. The total when I finally went through the statements was £94,000. £94,000 in 18 months. While I was at book group on Thursdays, and walking the dog on Saturday mornings and making Sunday roasts that Daniel and Natalie came to approximately every 6 weeks and ate while Natalie talked about the house renovations they were planning. I sat with the bank statement spread across my kitchen table and I thought, the kitchen extension, the new bathroom, the car Natalie had mentioned buying. I thought I funded all of it. I thought I paid for my own silence. I did not call Daniel immediately. This is the part people find surprising when I tell them. The natural assumption, the dramatic assumption, is that the moment you discover your son has stolen £94,000 from you, you pick up the phone and you confront him. I didn't. I sat at the kitchen table with the bank statements until 9 o'clock. Then I got dressed. Then I drove to the library, which opened at 9:30, where I sat at a computer terminal for 2 hours. I looked up family law solicitors in my area. I looked up the legal definition of financial abuse. I looked up what constitutes fraud between family members. I looked up the statute of limitations on civil claims. I looked up what documentation I would need. I printed 17 pages. I paid 40 pence for the printing. I drove home. I made lunch. At 2 o'clock I called a solicitor, a woman named Helen Tate, recommended by a friend of a friend. Family law and civil disputes. She had an appointment free at 4. I went at 4. I sat in her office and I laid the bank statements on her desk in order. She read them. She said, "How long has he had authorized access?" I said, 12 years. She said, "And the transfers, do you have any record of consenting to these?" I said, "No." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to be direct with you. What you are describing is, on the face of it, financial abuse by a family member with authorized access. The fact that he was authorized does not mean these transfers were authorized. The question is whether we can prove intent. I said, how do we prove intent? She said, we look at the pattern. Small transfers that escalate. No corresponding deposits. No evidence of loans agreed or gifts given. The pattern tells the story. I said, the pattern is very clear. She looked at me. She said, how are you? I said, I am angry. I will be sad later. Right now I am angry and I want to know what my options are. She said, good, angry is useful. Before I tell you about the confrontation, I need to stop for 1 second. Because if someone in your family has ever used your trust as a tool, if you have ever been generous with the wrong person, drop a comment below. Tell me what happened. I read every single one. And if this story is making your jaw tight, give it a like so more women can find it. Okay. I gave myself 1 week. Helen had advised me to gather documentation before making any contact with Daniel. Every bank statement for the past 3 years. Every record of gifts and transfers I had made voluntarily. Anything that established the difference between what I had given freely and what had been taken. I spent that week at my kitchen table with a highlighter and a spreadsheet. I found 47 transactions I had not authorized. I found 6 transactions that could conceivably have been gifts I had forgotten about, informal transfers made during phone calls I couldn't fully recall. I did not include these in the claim. I wanted only what I was certain about. The certain amount was £87,400. I also, and this was Helen's suggestion, began keeping a record of Daniel's communications during that week. He called on Wednesday. He texted on Thursday asking if I was coming to dinner Sunday. On Friday, Natalie sent me a photograph of what I now understood was my kitchen extension in the background of a picture she had posted on social media, captioned with something about loving her home. I screenshot all of it. On the Saturday, 1 week after the Tuesday, I called Daniel. I said, I'd like you to come over tomorrow alone. He said, Mom, is everything all right? I said, I'll see you tomorrow. Daniel arrived at 11 on Sunday morning. He was alone as I had asked. He came in the way he always came in, through the back door without knocking, the way he had done since he was a teenager. He was wearing the jacket I had bought him for Christmas. He looked well. He looked entirely, completely normal. He said, Mom, you sounded strange on the phone. Are you? I said. Sit down, Daniel. I had the bank statements on the table. Not all 47. The 6 most significant, the ones where the amounts were large enough that no reasonable interpretation made them accidental. £300 is within the territory of ambiguity. £12,000 is not. I put them in front of him. He looked at them. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Mom, I said, I want you to tell me what these are. He said, it's not, it's complicated. I said, it isn't complicated. I would like you to explain to me what these transfers are. He said, we were in a difficult patch. The renovation went over budget and Natalie's salary was cut and I thought. I said, you thought what, Daniel? He said, I thought you'd want to help. I let that sit on the table between us. He said, I was going to pay it back. I said, when? He said, when things settled down. I said, things settled down 18 months ago. Your kitchen extension was finished. Natalie's salary was reinstated. You bought a new car in April. When specifically were you going to pay it back? He opened his mouth. He closed it. I said, £87,400, Daniel. I have the statement. I have spoken to a solicitor. I have documentation for every transaction. The color left his face. He said, you've spoken to a solicitor? I said, yes. He said, Mom, you don't need to. I said, I do need to. I needed to the moment I found out my son had taken 40 years of savings without asking. He looked at the table. He said, does Natalie know you? I said, this is not a conversation about Natalie. This is a conversation between you and me. You had access to my account because I trusted you. You used that access to take money that was not yours. And then you came to my house for dinner, and you sat at my table and you never said a word. He was crying now. I watched him cry. I felt something, not the satisfaction that people sometimes describe in moments like this. Not nothing either. Something more complicated. The grief of looking at your child and seeing clearly someone you didn't fully know. I said, I am not going to shout at you. I am going to tell you what is going to happen. He looked up. I said, you are going to repay every penny. Helen Tate will draw up a repayment agreement. You will sign it. It will be legally binding. If you do not repay according to the schedule, I will pursue this through the courts and I will succeed because the evidence is unambiguous. He said, we can't, I said. Then you will need to work out how. I suggest you start with the kitchen extension. He looked at me for a long time. He said, "I'm sorry, Mum." I said, "I know." I stood up. I said, "I'd like you to leave now. Helen will be in touch this week." He left. I stood in the kitchen for a while, then I called Diane. 3 days later, Daniel called me, not to argue, not to negotiate. He called to tell me that he had told Natalie that he had sat her down and explained everything and that she had, and these were his words, not taken it well. I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "She said she thought you were giving us the money. She said she thought you knew." I said, "Daniel, do you believe that?" A long pause. Said, "I don't know what I believe." I said, "Let me ask you something. Did you ever tell me you were taking money from my account? Did you ask me? Did you tell me what it was for?" He said, "No." I said, "Then Natalie cannot have believed I knew, because there was nothing for her to base that belief on except what you told her." Another pause. He said, she said you'd been giving us money for years anyway. The deposit, the wedding. She said it was the same thing." I said, "A gift I freely give is not the same thing as money taken without my knowledge. Your wife is an intelligent woman. She knows the difference." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think she manipulated me into this." I sat with that. I said, "Daniel, I'm your mother. I have known you for 36 years. What I know about you is that you are not a bad person. What I also know is that you made a series of choices over 18 months that you could have stopped at any point. Whether Natalie encouraged them does not remove the fact that you made them." He said, "I know." I said, "The repayment agreement stands regardless of what happens between you and Natalie. That is between you two." He said, Are you and I?" I said, "I don't know yet. Ask me again in a year." The repayment agreement was signed 6 weeks later. Helen had negotiated a structured schedule, a significant lump sum from the equity in the house within 90 days, followed by monthly payments over 4 years. It was not everything at once, but it was binding and it was real, and it had Daniel's signature on it. The lump sum arrived in month 2. Daniel and Natalie remortgaged the house to release equity. The extension that my money had built now belonged, in a legal and circular way, to repaying me. There was something in that I noticed without quite knowing what to call it. Natalie and I have not spoken since the Sunday. I do not know whether we will. I do not know, when I am honest, what there would be to say. I do not hate her. I do not spend time thinking about her. She is someone who moved through my life and left a significant hole, and I have chosen to fill the hole rather than stand at the edge of it. Daniel and I are cautious with each other. We see each other. The conversations are shorter than they used to be and more careful. There is a transparency between us now that was not there before, not a comfortable transparency, not the easy kind, but an honest kind. We both know what happened. We are both living with the knowledge of what it cost. He asked me once, about 3 months in, "Do you still love me?" I said, "Yes, but differently now." He said, "How differently?" I said, with my eyes open. 40 years of savings. I have thought about what that phrase actually means. Not the number. Numbers are easy. Numbers are just figures on a screen, but the actual substance of it. The 30 pounds a month in 1987 when I was 25 and Daniel was a baby, and 30 pounds was the difference between managing and not managing, and I put it away anyway because future Margaret would need it. Future Margaret needed it. Just not in the way I had planned. What I know now that I did not know before is this: generosity is not a contract. I gave to Daniel over the years because I loved him and because I could, and because helping the people you love is one of the quiet joys of having built something. That generosity was real. It was mine to give. But real generosity requires a giver and a receiver who both understand the terms. The moment the receiver decides the terms for themselves, the moment they look at everything you have offered freely and decide that everything you have is therefore available, generosity has been converted into something else. I was not naive for trusting my son. I was trusting. Those are different things. And I was right to trust him, and he was wrong to take advantage of it. Both things are true simultaneously. The savings account has been rebuilt. Not to what it was. 4 years of repayments will not fully restore 40 years of compound savings, and I have made my peace with that. But to something, to enough. Future Margaret will be fine. She always was. I want to say one thing to the women who are sitting with something similar. To the women who have been generous with people who took advantage of that generosity, who gave freely and then discovered that freely had been misread as infinitely. You are not foolish for having trusted. You are not responsible for what someone else chose to do with your trust. The mistake was theirs. The rebuilding is yours. And the rebuilding, I want to tell you from the other side of it, is not only possible, it is clarifying. You discover in the process of rebuilding exactly what you are made of. I am made of 40 years of 30 pounds a month decisions. Nobody can take that from me. Drop a comment below. Tell me your version of this. Tell me about the person who took advantage of your generosity and what you did when you found out. And if Margaret's story moved you, share it. One person, someone who needs to know that finding out, however late, is always better than not knowing. Subscribe for new stories every single day. I will see you tonight.